The piano in the saloon had gone quiet when it happened. Cards lay scattered on the table, whiskey glasses half raised but forgotten, and every pair of eyes turned toward the door. A woman stood there, her shoulders drawn in like she wished she could vanish, and the laughter that broke out was cruel and cutting. "God help the fool that takes her home," one of the cowhands muttered, not even bothering to lower his voice. A few men chuckled, and the sound of it bit deeper than any blade could have. She didn't answer, didn't even look their way, just gripped the edge of her shawl tighter in her fist and crossed the room as though her boots weighed 100 pounds each. And that's when he did it. Levi Coulter stood up slow from his chair in the corner. He didn't say a word, didn't glare at them or give some grand speech about decency. He just stepped across the warped saloon floor, boots thudding heavy in the silence, and held out his hand to her. Right there in front of every last one of them. The laughter died like someone had smothered a lamp. But to understand why that simple act felt like a gunshot, you'd have to know who Levi Coulter was, and what the woman they all mocked had endured. Dust hung in the late summer air outside the town of Red Hollow, swirling in lazy eddies as a wagon creaked past the general store. The place was small, a half-forgotten stop along the stage route, with nothing but 2 saloons, a blacksmith, and a scattering of wooden shacks pretending to be homes. Folks there lived hard, worked harder, and they all knew each other's business more than they should. The woman's name was Clara May. She'd come to Red Hollow 2 years back, stepping off a coach with a worn carpetbag and a face that made people stare. Not because it was striking, but because it wasn't. Her jaw sat a little crooked, her eyes uneven, and her teeth bore the kind of gaps a lifetime of hunger leaves behind. Clara spoke softly, kept to herself, and stitched clothes for ranch families who couldn't afford new ones. But that didn't stop the whispers. Ugly, they said. A spinster too poor to be wanted. Children mimicked her behind her back. Women pitted her. Men made bets about who'd dare to call on her, knowing none of them ever would. Levi Coulter had watched all that from a distance. He was a man used to distances, kept them like other folks kept money. He'd fought for the Union once, came home to find nothing waiting but empty land and ghosts he didn't talk about. Years on the range had left him quiet, with hands rough as rawhide and eyes that missed nothing. Every trip into town, he saw Clara May at the well or stepping from the mercantile, her shoulders rounded in a way that made her seem smaller than she was. Folks didn't mean their cruelty half the time. That was just how it was in places where life was hard. People sharpened their tongues the way they sharpen knives. Still, it stayed with him. That evening, the saloon smelled of tobacco and spilled whiskey. Rain threatened in the west, a bruised sky pressing low over the prairie. Levi sat at his usual table, nursing a drink, when Clara May stepped through the swinging doors. She hadn't meant to walk in there. Everyone could see it in the way she froze just inside, her eyes darting toward the bar like maybe she'd find someone to fetch the parcel she'd been sent for. But the man behind the counter was already smirking, and the laughter rose like wolves circling a weak deer. Levi felt it then, the familiar burn in his gut that had nothing to do with whiskey. He remembered boys in uniform, too young to shave, jeering at a farmer's daughter who tried to help feed them. He remembered staying silent because it was easier, because standing up meant getting your teeth knocked out. This time, he didn't stay sitting. He crossed the room slow, every eye following him, the sound of his boots loud in the hush. Clara May's hand had started to tremble where it clutched her shawl. She didn't look up until his shadow fell across her. Levi held out his hand. No smile, no speech, just an open hand, steady as the ground itself. She blinked at it like she didn't understand. Then, after the longest heartbeat, she put her own hand in his. Someone at the bar muttered a curse. Another man snorted in disbelief. But Levi didn't look back at them. He just guided her out through the saloon doors into the cooling night air. Outside, the sky had gone copper with the last of the sunset. Crickets chirred in the weeds near the hitching posts. Clara May stared down at their joined hands like she didn't know what to do next. "You don't owe me nothin'," Levi said finally, his voice low and even. She shook her head a little. I don't understand why." He didn't answer right away. just studied her like a man weighing words too heavy to drop carelessly. Because, he said at last, they were wrong to laugh. It was a small thing to say, but her eyes glistened as if he'd handed her a whole life she thought she'd never have. Back in the saloon, men were already muttering, already turning that moment into something meaner than it was. By morning, the story would twist through Red Hollow like barbed wire, tangling in every fence post and doorway, and Levi Coulter knew it. As he handed Clara May up onto the wagon seat, the quiet weight of what he'd done settled over him like a saddle blanket before a long, rough ride. Whatever happened next, there'd be no going back. The morning sun burned away the last of the night's cool, and with it came the talk. By the time Levi rode into town for supplies, whispers already clung to him like burrs. Men leaning against fence posts spat tobacco juice and looked at him too long. Women at the mercantile counter glanced up from their bolts of fabric, lips pinched like they'd bitten into something sour. Levi Coulter's finally lost his senses. Old Clem Hadley muttered to a cluster of ranch hands outside the livery. Taking up with her, of all people. You think he means to marry her? One of the younger men asked with a cruel grin. Boy like him? Could have near any woman he wants. And he chooses Clara May. They laughed then, low and bitter. Levi heard every word as he passed, but he didn't break stride. Clara May hadn't left her small shack all morning. The night before, after Levi had walked her home, she'd stood in the doorway clutching her shawl, not knowing whether to thank him or apologize. Now she sat at the little table in her kitchen, staring at her work-worn hands. Her cheeks burned with the memory of the saloon, the laughter, and then, his hand, steady and warm, lifting her out of it like it hadn't mattered at all. But she knew it did. In a town like Red Hollow, everything mattered. By midday, Levi came to her door with a sack of flour balanced on one shoulder. You didn't have to, she began, but he stepped inside and set it down gently on the table. They'll be talkin', he said, voice level. Her eyes dropped to her lap. I know. You care what they say? She hesitated. I've spent my whole life trying not to. Her voice cracked just enough to betray the truth. Levi's jaw tightened. They've been wrong about plenty before. That evening, as the sky turned lavender over the plains, Levi led Clara May down the single dusty street of Red Hollow. He didn't speak, didn't rush her, just walked at her pace while folks on porches and outside the saloon stared like they were seeing something scandalous unfold in front of them. At the edge of town, young Betsy Turner whispered too loudly to her friend, "Why would he want her?" Levi stopped, turned his head just enough for Betsy to see the steel in his eyes, and the girl's mouth snapped shut. It wasn't long before the pushback came. At the blacksmith's forge, Clem Hadley cornered Levi while the iron hissed in the quench barrel. Levi, you know what folks are sayin'. Ain't good for her, ain't good for you neither. Levi wiped sweat from his brow and looked the man square in the eye. What they say don't change what's right. Clem's mouth twisted. Right's what keeps order in a place like this. You start breaking them rules, folks lose their way. Levi didn't answer. He just turned back to the glowing iron, hammer ringing sharp against the anvil. But the tide of talk kept rising. By week's end, the preacher himself came calling, hat in hand but eyes sharp as nails. Mr. Coulter, Reverend Pike said, standing stiff on Levi's porch. Folks are unsettled. Clara May. She's been through enough without this attention. Levi leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. You worried for her? Or just your flock? The preacher swallowed hard. Both. Levi's voice stayed calm, but there was iron in it. Then maybe teach him not to tear down what they don't understand. That night, Clara May sat alone by her small fire, hands clasped tight in her lap. She could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in town, every word whispered behind her back. She didn't want Levi hurt for her sake, but she also couldn't forget the way his hand had felt. Steady, certain, like she was worth being seen. She stared into the firelight, and for the first time in years, a thought came unbidden. What if I didn't have to be alone anymore? The next morning, the tension sharpened. Levi stepped into the saloon for a sack of coffee, and 3 men at the bar turned to face him. One, a big rancher named Dolan, smirked. "Coulter," Dolan drawled. "Heard you're settlin' for scraps." The other 2 laughed. Levi didn't blink. "Funny. I heard you're still scared of a woman with a mind of her own." The laughter died. Dolan's grin turned mean. "Careful," he said, voice low. Levi set his coin on the counter, collected the coffee, and left without another word. But word spread faster than wildfire. Levi Coulter wasn't backing down. And the angrier the town got, the more it became clear that sooner or later, someone was going to force the matter. The wind shifted 2 days later, carrying with it the smell of rain and something heavier, trouble. Levi was mending a broken fence rail when a rider appeared on the ridge. Dust curled around the horse's hooves as the man sat there, watching. Then he turned and rode back toward town. By sundown, word reached Levi. Dolan and a few others had been drinking hard, talking louder, saying things that didn't stay just words for long. Inside Clara May's shack, the single lamp flickered weakly against the walls. She sat by the window, mending a child's dress for a ranch family that barely paid her enough to live on. Her hands worked steady, but her mind churned. Every day since Levi had offered her his hand, the world felt both larger and more dangerous. For the first time in years, she felt seen. But being seen made her a target. The knock on her door that night nearly made her drop her needle. Levi stood there, hat in hand, rain beating on his coat. "They're stirrin' things up," he said simply. She swallowed. "Because of me." "No, because they need someone to look down on." Clara May's throat tightened. "I don't want you gettin' hurt over me." Levi's eyes softened, but there was no wavering in them. "Some things are worth standin' for." Back in town, the saloon door slammed open as Dolan staggered out with 2 men at his side. "He thinks he's better than us?" Dolan growled. "Paradin that woman around like he's savon her." "Preacher won't say nothin'," one of the others muttered. "Says it ain't his place." "Then it's ours," Dolan snapped. By midnight, they'd made their plan. Words weren't enough anymore. The next morning, the sky was heavy with clouds that promised a storm. Levi stepped out of Clara May's shack, scanning the horizon. He felt it before he saw it, the way the air changed when men decided they were past talking. The first rider came into view, then another and another. Dolan at the front, jaw set, eyes hard. Clara May stepped out behind Levi, clutching her shawl tight. Her breath caught at the sight of the men approaching, rifles slung low, anger riding with them like a second shadow. Levi stepped off the porch, his boots sinking slightly in the damp earth. He didn't reach for his gun. "Morning, Dolan," he called evenly. Dolan reined in his horse, glaring down at him. "Coulter, we ain't here to jaw. You're making this town look like fools." "Or just showing 'em what fools look like," Levi replied. The men behind Dolan shifted uneasily. One spat in the mud, muttering under his breath. "This ends now," Dolan snapped. "Either you stop walking her through town like she's something, or what?" Levi asked, voice quiet but steady. Dolan's hand twitched near his rifle. Clara May stepped forward then, her voice barely above a whisper. "Levi." He glanced back at her just long enough for her to see the calm in his eyes. But inside, Levi knew this was the moment. One wrong move, one twitch too quick, and blood would hit the ground. From the far end of town, the church bell rang once, sharp and hollow. People had gathered, men, women, even children, watching from porches and doorways. Every eye was on the standoff. The rain finally started, soft at first, beating on the rifle barrels and darkening the dust. "You think this makes you a man?" Levi said quietly, looking straight at Dolan. "Scarin' a woman who's done nothin' but try to live decent?" Dolan's jaw clenched. "I think a man knows his place. And hers." Levi took a slow step forward, boots squelching in the wet dirt. "Maybe that's the problem." The men behind Dolan exchanged glances. One of them shifted in his saddle, clearly uneasy. The storm broke then, lightning cracking across the prairie sky, thunder rolling like cannon fire. And in that split second of distraction, Dolan's hand went to his rifle. Levi didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, rain running down his face, staring Dolan down like the weight of the whole town's soul rested in that look. No one fired, but the moment hung there, sharp as a drawn blade, one breath away from blood. The rain poured harder, soaking every man in the street, turning the dirt to thick mud. Clara May stood frozen on the porch, her shawl plastered to her shoulders, her hair clinging to her cheeks. Dolan's hand still hovered over his rifle, but the hesitation in his eyes betrayed him. He wasn't used to being challenged, not like this, not by a man who wouldn't back down and wouldn't draw first. Levi didn't look at the rifle. His eyes stayed on Dolan's face, calm, unshaken. "Go on," Levi said quietly, the rain muffling his words. "Show 'em all what kind of man you are." Something in that steadiness, something in the way Levi stood without fear, broke through the mob's anger. One of Dolan's men, a wiry ranch hand named Thomas, glanced at Clara May, then at Dolan. His jaw tightened. "This ain't right," Thomas muttered. Dolan snapped his head toward him. "What did you say?" Thomas straightened in his saddle. "She ain't done nothin' to deserve this." Another man shifted, looking suddenly ashamed. Clara May stepped off the porch then. Her boots sank into the mud, her thin dress plastered to her legs by the rain. She moved slowly, her face pale but her chin raised higher than it had ever been. "Do you even know my name?" she asked softly. Dolan blinked, caught off guard. "My name," she repeated. "Do you know it?" He didn't answer. "Didn't think so." She stopped a few feet from Levi, rain dripping from her hair. Her voice trembled, but she didn't look away. "My name is Clara May. I've lived here 2 years. I've mended your children's clothes. I've made dresses for your wives. I've spent my life working hard, and never once have I asked any of you for a thing." The silence that followed was heavier than the rain. Levi glanced at her, pride in his eyes, though he said nothing. "You've called me ugly," Clara May went on, voice gaining strength. "Laughed at me like I can't hear, like I ain't worth nothin' to—" She took another step forward, her voice clear now despite the rain. "But you're wrong. I'm worth more than your cruel words. And this man," she gestured to Levi, "is the only one of you who had the courage to see it." The mob shifted, their shame growing heavier by the second. Dolan, his face red with a mixture of rage and humiliation, finally broke. He turned his horse sharply, splashing mud, and galloped away. His men, after a moment's hesitation, followed. Silence fell over the street, broken only by the steady drumming of the rain. Clara May stood there, breathing hard, her eyes fixed on Levi. He reached out, and she took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Levi just squeezed her hand. He didn't need words. The town had seen what he saw, not an ugly spinster, but a woman of courage and dignity. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start changing things. They stood there for a long time, hand in hand, as the rain washed the dust from the street and the shame from the air. The town watched, silent, as the man who didn't talk and the woman they'd scorned walked back toward her small shack, together. And for the first time, no one laughed.